every man has a season. Every man has a mountain. Every man listening to this, you have something the Lord prepared you to do. You may be doing it now, or you may be most likely you're in a preparation stage getting ready to do it. But we have Psalm 1 as a promise. And Psalm 1 says that we will in right time bear fruit in our season. So there's a season for every man that will bear fruit. There was a season in the life of Jesus. That season was 3 years, maybe 3.5 years. And there's preparation, there's testing, there's some suffering, there's some obedience, there's some things he has to do to get ready so he can go through and totally fulfill and bring forth, like we know in a harvest time, some 30, some 60, some 100-fold. Jesus brings in the harvest. He shows us and models what 100-fold looks like. So he's our model, he's our standard, but I want us to learn from what he does and how he prepares himself as well.
We're talking Jesus as the standard for manhood and masculinity today, guys. And I'm pretty sure it's not going to be what you think. So let's go. Well, hey guys, welcome into the Next Man Up podcast. Once again, I am your host, Mark Stanifer, and I'm honored to be with you for another episode today. And thank you for being part of this community. Whether this is your first time or you've been with us for a while, we are grateful you have chosen to be with us, a community that is about being and raising up healthy and godly men. Guys, today my guest is Josh Khachadourian, and man, this is a great, fast-paced, and insightful conversation that you're going to get to hear in just a minute. But before I get to that, let me just tell you a little bit about who Josh is. He's a husband, he's a father, he's a leader, and a coach on a mission to lift up Jesus as the standard by which all of life's decisions, passions, and pursuits will be measured by. Here's a couple of his accomplishments. In the fitness angle, he was a New York State bodybuilding champion at the age of 20. He's got entrepreneur experience with a fitness business that he grew to 3 locations and over $700K in revenue. In the corporate world, he's ascended that ladder and has built and led high-performing teams through his servant leadership style that has created impact by growing people and profits. And while all that is good, here are the things I think matter even more. He's a committed husband and a dedicated father. He's been married to his wife, Rachel, for over 15 years. Together, they're raising their 3 children to be giant killers, instilling a strong faith to believe for the impossible and grow into the fullest expression of who they are created to be. I wanted to connect with Josh because I heard how he reframes understanding Jesus, and not just Jesus the divine, but Jesus the human, Jesus the man. And it's not what I grew up with. Maybe like I grew up with an image of Jesus that is European looking in appearance, effeminate, nice and clean. That portrait on the wall of the church that I went to as a kid growing up. And Josh breaks that stereotype. And at the same time, he does it without going to the other extreme, which I see so often in this space of manhood and masculinity. It's the man hair and the muscles and the might as the answer to the problem of being too feminine, effeminate, how Christianity, how manhood has been feminized. Josh doesn't go to the other extreme. Like Jesus dismantled the thinking of his day, Josh is helping us dismantle the thinking of our day on who Jesus is, and he really highlights how and why he is our standard. Okay, that's enough about Josh, about the conversation. We're going to get into, hang on guys, this is a fast-paced conversation, and I bet it's going to challenge some of your assumptions and help you see this man Jesus in a new light. So here we go. Josh Khachadourian and Jesus as the standard. Well, Josh, it's an honor to have you on the show today. I appreciate you coming on. And as I told you before we started recording, I'm excited to get into this topic because I think it's relevant. I think it is timely for where we are. And I so appreciate you coming on, bringing your expertise and your wisdom and your passion for our audience today.
Mark, I'm so excited to be here. I'm honored to be on your show, and I've been looking forward to this interview. So yeah, thanks for welcoming me.
Yeah, let's go. So I've talked to a number of guys who, for illustration purposes, let's say they've gone the prodigal path. They've had the come to Jesus moment, and now they're back and they're working in the space for men or for fathers. But that's not your story. So I'm intrigued by your story because it's not what I've heard so frequently. So talk a little bit about your story and maybe from your perspective, how you were able to avoid maybe that prodigal path to end up where you are today.
Wow, that's a big question. And I'm going to take this, from a couple different angles, Mark, because you're making me think, because I have 3 children of my own right now, right? So I have young kids. So even as you're saying this, what you're triggering me is, how am I raising them? Because it's really one and the same. How was I raised? And I know you have a lot of fathers on this show that are listening in. The question behind the question is, how do we raise our kids not to stray, right? So let me tell you my story, and I'm going to just I'll just do my best to make those merge. So we're kind of answering 2 questions here, and you can jump in at anything I say. But just for the listeners, my background is I was fortunate to grow up into a Christian household. My mother came to the Lord first. She came out of an Orthodox background. She had all the religious form. She had religion. She was, one of the best, I think they have like a salutatorian of the Sunday school class. She did really well. And it wasn't until later in life where she got a letter from a friend of hers who talked about having a personal relationship with Jesus. And this was just totally foreign language to her. And that eventually led to her coming to the Lord. It's a really powerful testimony. And from there, there was a series of steps in sharing the gospel with my family. This is all before I'm born, or maybe I'm just being born at the time. And I think I am. This is probably about maybe right after I was born is when my mom is having this experience, and seeing the family come to the Lord and kind of just being born into that type of environment. And there was a series of steps. They decided they had to leave that church. They had to go somewhere else. They had to get plugged in. And my mom and both my parents are very strong Christians at this point, but it was really my mom who raised me. My dad was working really hard. He's an awesome father, great example. But it was my mom who took the time, and she broke out the flannel board. She did the Bible stories with us. I remember going to Sunday school, youth group, all of that stuff. And, the main key I'll say here, because we're talking about how did we not stray? Well, I won't tell you. It's not like I was on fire for God at 5 years old and I never died off or never went a different direction. I just don't have a radical, sinful past that the Lord delivered me from. I've been fortunate enough to be raised the right way. And when you're raised the right way, the promise in Scripture is that you raise a child the way they should go. And when they get older, they won't depart. And that's my story. I never departed into a huge season of, living for myself and living for the world. Of course, we always battle, our natural, our flesh, that natural man that tries to pull us towards tendencies that we might have. But overall, I didn't get addicted to drugs. I've never been in jail, all those things, right? So I think the opposite is, a lot of guys that come from our different backgrounds, maybe you don't have that testimony, but maybe the side that attracts you is being too driven, or it's trying to do everything on your own. And right, maybe that's where my path took me to start my own business. But even when I was doing that, I was still walking with the Lord. So to put a bow on this, I have a solid background with the way my family brought me up. But I will also say that even though I knew the Lord and I was walking with him, there's dimensions to our walk with the Lord. So it probably wasn't until high school when I got really serious with the Lord, I was nervous about heading out into the world, going into college. I was a little bit apprehensive of what am I going to encounter? And I just had an experience with God that changed my life. And, I was committed to him and walking that out. And that's been my Christian journey.
So I was talking to one of those guys that I was referring to a while back, someone who appeared on the podcast. He's like, man, you don't really want to hear my story, which is the prodigal story. We're a dime a dozen. You want to hear the guy that was doing it better than me, doing it right, so to speak, from the beginning. And to some extent, that's a little bit of my story. Again, not perfection, but didn't have to come from the pig trough back into the arms of the Father. I got a good start. Like you, my parents were engaged and involved. They taught me from the beginning, gave me a foundation to build on. And I think, Josh, maybe that's part of the reason why I'm drawn a little bit to your story, is because it's more similar to mine than the guy that didn't have the example or chose to rebel from that example and ended up one day saying, why the heck am I eating the scraps of the pigs? I need to go back. And, turned through Jesus's grace and some changes in their lives, turn themselves around. But that's not my story. And again, kind of repeating myself here, but I think that's part of the reason why I was drawn to yours and wanted to just pull it out. Maybe you've never felt this way, but sometimes those of us with stories like ours can feel, let me say it this way, sometimes I can feel a little less than in this ministry space because I didn't have the big transformation. I didn't have the radical story. What's interesting, curious your reaction, is I've heard the opposite from the guys who have that radical story. They're like, oh, I wish I had a story more like yours, Mark. I don't know how this is landing with you. I'm spending too much of the time talking and not listening. I'll let you respond.
Yeah, no, I'd love to comment on that. No, this is great. I appreciate it, Mark. I think, that's easy for us. In church culture, it's easy for us as Christians to feel like, wow, I don't have a radical deliverance, or I didn't go through anything crazy like the guy giving his testimony on the platform or something like that. But I mean, now that I have young kids, I'm raising them to finish well, right? To run their race, to be strong, to be single-minded, to be focused on the prize that's ahead of them, to run after that upward call. And there is no shame whatsoever in living your highest life and going after it, leaving it all on the field without having a huge mess up. Now, let's not get it wrong. For anyone listening, this doesn't mean I never messed up. Right. Like, quite the contrary, right? I just didn't fall into a huge open sin and live that lifestyle for a long time. But obviously, I've made mistakes in my life. I'm sure you have too. So we're not here saying that we're perfect, but I get what you're saying, because there's this contrast with, someone who came out of a lifestyle of drugs, or has a crazy past where you're like, wow, that's such a wild story. My story doesn't seem that wild, but I'm okay with that. I'm totally fine with that. And that's the way I'm going to raise my children, to run after their race and to stay focused and let that steadfastness and let that, endurance play out. Let that be the story, because there's a lot of battles you got to overcome to be that guy, right? That's a lot of self-control. And I know we're going to get into the book and, we'll talk about self-mastery, but how do you live that overcoming lifestyle without getting majorly tripped up? What did you have to have in your life? What kind of boundaries did you have to set for yourself to do that? And so I want to be clear for the listeners, there's no shame in either one, because Jesus redeems everything. He makes everything new, right? So if you made a mistake and you fell, and the Lord can restore you regardless of where you are right now. But at the same time, if you feel like, hey, I didn't have an exciting life, I never did the journey of the prodigal and came back, and I feel like I don't have a huge testimony, you do have a testimony, So I think the Lord uses all of it, and one is not less than the other, but I'm really impressed. I mean, right now, let's just think about, we can do this with Christian leaders. We could do this with business leaders. It really doesn't matter. But it's so rare to find a man with endurance that can stay focused and leave a legacy. and not fall, not crumble in their life. Because so many guys achieve success or they reach this pinnacle. And then you find out later, and unfortunately it's happening more than we'd like to see, but everything's getting shaken. And when things get shaken, are you going to be exposed and something came out that you had a hidden lifestyle or a secret sin? And I say we need to use that to be on guard and just live for the Lord all out. Let's go all out. Let's stay focused. Let's stay single-minded and really apprehended with this vision of being an overcomer.
I love it, man. Let's go. Let's go. And thank you for the comments about one is not greater or lesser than the other. We have our stories, and Jesus takes where we are. And as long as we're willing to surrender and go with him, he'll make it better for his glory and for the benefit of us in the kingdom. So right on, man. Thank you.
Yeah.
So I want to drill in a little bit into when Jesus really became not just Lord, but like when he really caught your attention. You know, in your spiritual journey, obviously the strong upbringing and a great head start, but when did Jesus really catch your attention such that it led to ultimately us having the conversation that we're having today and the work that you're doing in the book and the podcast, which we'll make sure we point listeners to here in a bit? Like, when did that happen for you?
Well, it's a great question. You know, this is what I notice right now, Mark. I'm just going to take one step backwards before I could jump right into that. Is there's a lot of great biblical principles out there. There's a lot of great churches. There's lots of great Christian schools. There's lots of great methods of thinking, approaching the word, approaching God. And sometimes they become frameworks. Sometimes they become biblical principles. And we've become very good, just as a human race, at using principles and taking something that's meant to be a living relationship, and we can distill it down, because this is what men do. We make it into systems. This is where, denominations come from. We have frameworks, we have methods, and there's things we do. And I'll say there's a lot of good in that, right? Our nation is founded on a Judeo-Christian work ethic and principle and moral code. And that's great. And I think we can find a lot of men and a lot of people using biblical principles, but we want to move past that into a relationship. And as you grow up and you get the Bible stories and you have that kind of upbringing, it's easy to get a grid for what's right, what's wrong, and to know of God. And then there comes this point, and I think this gets to the heart of your question, is when do you really meet him, and what's that like? Right. And I think it comes in stages. I think it comes in a progression. As I'm watching my children, they're learning their Bible stories. They're learning about God. They're praying to God, but there's going to come a time, and my prayer for them is that they would have an experience with God, that it would be more than just what they read on the page or a song they sing. So for me, it's hard for me to point to one specific day because of my background, but I just remember times of the Lord showing up and revealing himself to me in different ways. And I'd probably have to go to like my senior year in high school and, into my first year of college is when I was getting really serious and my faith was going to a different level, where I was spending a lot of time in the Word and I was spending a lot of time in prayer. And what I'll say is it was an experience. Jesus invites us into experience. And that's what he did when he walked the earth as well. He invited people into an experience. He didn't come to give us a new set of rules or laws to follow or a new religion. And in fact, he disrupted everything they knew of religion to bring in this radical relationship. So for me, I would say that we need an experience. And for me personally, that happened in my high school years when I was getting really serious about the Lord and I was really pursuing him. And, the promise in scripture is that if we draw close to him, he draws close to us. So, just a quick, encouragement for anyone listening. Like, if you're like, hey, I don't have that experience, or I want that, you have to take initiative in your relationship. God can arrest you. He can get your attention. There's lots of things he can do to get us and to lead us to himself, but we equally can show initiative in this relationship. And we can say, you know what? I'm going to be intentional. I'm going to step forward. And through that, we can go into a much deeper relationship than we have right now.
So before we started recording, I was telling you just a little bit of my journey, and overly simplified, it was from that framework, rule following, obedience focused grid into freedom and intimacy and a love based relationship, out of which grew the obedience and the faithfulness, not unlike in our marriages. You know, you don't have rules in your marriages so that you can love your wife. You have love for your wife, out of which grows the rules and the guidelines, if you will. So that is some of that was a key journey for me. And along that path, I started to really notice Jesus isn't just the king and the savior. Yes, for sure. But he was also human. And it began to draw me into this idea of who was Jesus the man. And when I heard you on a podcast recently and talk about this, I knew I wanted to have this conversation with you, because I think we've really gotten it wrong when it comes to who Jesus was. Whether it's culture, whether it's Gentile versus Jew, whether it's Western versus Eastern, maybe all of that and then some, I think we've gotten it wrong. I think you believe that as well. So let me just throw that back at you in the form of a question. When it comes to Jesus, where have we gotten it wrong?
So my response to that, and this is really the catalyst for why did I write a book called The Standard, Discovering Jesus as the Standard for Masculinity, is because in partaking in men's groups, in being in the church, in seeing the way other men relate to Jesus, we hold him up as, and like you said, rightfully so, he is the Son of God. He's the King of Kings. He's the Lord of Lords. And in the middle of that, many men have lost sight of the fact that Jesus came 100% man and 100% God, that he also was known as the Son of Man. In fact, that was his favorite self-descriptor. And what I've seen is that men, and this plays out a couple different ways, but men don't find themselves worthy to even draw close to Jesus sometimes, or they make him this ethereal figure that they can't relate to, right? So he's very unrelatable. He's like this distant, stained glass, stoic figure that they just feel like they'll never be good enough, or they got to keep trying harder. And then the other way this manifests, I think, in Christian arenas, is that we study the life of other men of the Bible. We have no problem looking at the life of David because he failed, right? So we can look at all these different Christian characters and we find ourselves in them, but we have a harder time when it comes to looking at Jesus because he is the Son of God. He is the Son of Man as well. And we'll talk about that. And so I think that's where we get it wrong from my perspective, is that we need to make Jesus relatable, accessible, still maintain who he is in his identity, but he's also the forerunner. He's the pioneer. He's the firstborn. He's the second man. These are all biblical titles that identify him as a man and what he pioneered for other men. So because he did it and because he modeled it, we can now do it. He went first so he could bring forth many, many brethren, many brothers, many men that can follow in his footsteps.
Even as you're talking though, Josh, I'm back into my early upbringing days, and I see this European, fair-skinned, lighter brown hair portrait on the wall of the church, and it's like that image is still seared in my mind of who Jesus is. And I think part of what we're wrestling with today is in our desires that are built within us. How do they reconcile with that, I'll just say it, that effeminate looking, weakish looking man that's on, like, how do we, what is a better image, I guess, is the question that I'm getting to. Because even as I'm listening to you talk, knowing the answer, or at least part of it, I'm still drawn back to that as the image of the man, Jesus.
Right. So there's a couple ways of how we got here. I'm really more concerned with how do we see him. We can talk about how we got there really quick. Hey, here's the deal. Christianity's been feminized. Okay. So every guy listening to this, because of the Industrial Revolution, because of the way things happened, men left the homes. We at some point in history during the Industrial Revolution, we were the head of the house. We worked on the farm. We were there with our families, leading our families. And when we left, the women started going to church without us because the men got sucked into the worldly system. They were there, they're palling around with their guys at the mill, in the plant, wherever they were working. And what happened was that created a big gap at church. That created a big gap in the way church was being done at that time in history. So then we see, modern day or pastors back then emerge, and they have to start catering their services to their biggest parishioners. That is the women, right? So we start to get these feminine attributes in the church, and this is where you get the floral arrangements from. There's nothing wrong with flowers. I don't have a problem with flowers whatsoever. But this is where like the pastel colors, this is where the artwork, the different things that started to creep in. And then when a guy goes back to church, he's like, I don't really feel like I fit in here anymore, right? And so it was this system, this vicious cycle that just got a lot of women in church, and it pushed the guys away farther. So I think that's part of the issue. We can at least acknowledge that. That's the history of Christianity, at least within America, because of the Industrial Revolution that took men away from the family and created that cycle. Now, here's the real Jesus, and I love the real Jesus. The real Jesus is found in Scripture. If we would just read our Bible, I don't really care what he looks like. I don't believe I have a lot of content on this that I believe Jesus was a strong man. He was a builder. So let's get a couple things right. And I'll give you an image. If someone needs a mental image to anchor to in terms of who is the man Jesus, well, he could have been born into any level of society, but he chooses, and the Father chooses for him to come in as a blue collar worker. So think about that. Wherever you are in life right now, Jesus could have came in as a rabbi. He could have came in, in the religious type system. He doesn't. He comes in like everyone else in that day, and he's a builder. People like to call him a carpenter. The actual word is a builder, and he grew up in a city where there wasn't a lot of wood. So he most likely worked with stone. He probably worked with wood as well. So if you're going to be a stonemason, if you're going to build things and you're going to deal with customer service and you're going to take on projects, you're not going to be, you're going to be a pretty strong guy, especially in that day and age. They don't have the same conveniences we have, right? So he was strong. There's no question about it. I have at least 8 instances in Scripture where I could show you physical strength, physical endurance, things that we're doing now as biohacks and things we're doing for our best life to be as healthy and become the best version of ourselves. This is all in the Bible. This is the way Jesus was living, right? From his diet to the steps that he took, how much he walked, to the fasts he went on, to the types of physical labor he does, and even some of his miracles that require strength. When he pulls Peter, a full-grown man, out of the water, he pulls him up with his hand, he grabs him, and then he pulls him up, right? He flips tables. So this is the Jesus I follow. This is who he was as a man. So that might be a new image for some people, but he's not this effeminate European white guy who's wispy, who's floating around on a cloud. And what we've done is we remade him. We fashioned him through history to fit a grid that we want him to be. And like, this is what the world thinks of Jesus. They think he's a peace-loving hippie that loves people in the current version of love, which is I accept you any way you are, and I won't tell you the truth. But that's so contrary, Mark, to what we see in the Bible. I mean, he's so confrontational. Because he loves people, he tells them the truth. Like, Jesus did not, you can just take a look at this. I'm going to dive into this a little bit more from my own personal study, but Jesus never made it easy. Like, he was not an easy guy. It wasn't just like, come and follow me and your life will be easy. He said hard things. He challenged people. He cut right through all the religious mindsets, the political stuff that people had to deal with. And, there's a lot of hard sayings. There's a lot of things he said where you can see from his personality and from what he does and how he speaks that he is 100% man. He's 100% love. He's 100% truth and confrontational in his delivery as well.
There's a word that someone I followed for a while used that really resonated with me in terms of who Jesus was, and it's subversive. He was subversive to the religious culture, to the political culture, even to the economic culture that existed at the time. And so I've always been drawn to that word, and I think you're pointing out good examples of what that is, and maybe even shattering some images for the listeners. I also want to just pause here and make space for dudes like me that are 5'9", $150, and I'm not a blue collar guy. I'm not a manual laborer, and I think part of why this topic intrigues me so much is we're able to see Jesus in a more realistic portrayal of the man that he was and the life that he lived, that blue collar, hard scrabble in a lower economic, impoverished area life. But the pushback from the feminization that we often see doesn't have to be Arnold Schwarzenegger, muscle-bound, or the SEAL team leader who's on the military missions. Like, I'm not putting down either. I'm saying it can be a both and. Like, we don't have to push back from the effeminate and go militaristic. At the same time, there can be space for those of us that will never look like Arnold, but still learn what strength and power and masculinity in the Jesus standard way looks like. Yes, you tracking with me?
I love it. Yeah. I mean, Jesus invited ordinary men. That's what he does. He takes ordinary men. He wasn't assembling SEAL Team 6, right? He wasn't looking for the most polished. In fact, he uses weakness, right? So we're all good candidates of that. So it has nothing to do with what you look and image you portray, because that's not real strength. You know, he shows us that real strength comes from within. You know, do I believe he could, you know, I don't believe he was incredibly weak. You know, I don't think he was a bodybuilder, right? We didn't have the same type of, you know, gym routine or anything like that. I believe he was a strong man. But when I say strong man, I'm not just referencing an outward appearance, although he most likely was strong, but he was strong internally. He was strong in the Lord. He was strong in spirit. And that's what he invites us into. And that's where it takes real courage to live that life. And he takes people that are in their weakness, and he transforms them through his strength. So we can look at Peter, for example, who's a strong-willed guy, right? He's a strong-willed guy, but he ends up breaking down. He denies Jesus, right? He crumbles like a puddle. He's done. And he denies the Lord, and Jesus gives him strength. Jesus takes that natural man and he shows him how to live a life of surrender. And then that same Peter, a couple chapters over, now emerges in strength. I'm not talking about just physical strength. He emerges in strength in his calling, infused with the Spirit of God, an anointing that comes upon him, the presence of God upon him. That's where our real strength comes from. And then Peter will preach and 3,000 men get saved. The same guy that denied Jesus 3 times. If we want to go really deeper into this, I'm even being reminded of Samson, who had physical strength, but even his physical strength was connected to the presence of the Lord. So when the Lord came upon him, we can read it. We can go right to Judges and read that. When the presence of the Lord came upon him, also known as the anointing, that's when he could do supernatural acts of strength. When that presence departed him, he was a mere mortal. He had no strength. He had nothing, even though he still might have been physically big. So when we talk about strength, Mark, we're talking about something the Lord gives us, something that you can't fake it. You can't just go into the gym and kind of put on an ego or put on a persona to act a certain way. That's not strength. That's the opposite of strength.
So I love that because you can't go into the boardroom and fake the strength there in negotiation, or you can't go into onto the sports field and fake it there, right? And it seems to me that if and when we discover a broader and more holistic image of who Jesus was, it allows us to then redefine what it means to be strong, what it means to have leadership, what it means to take dominion, you know, like these things that have gotten I guess maybe the way I would say it is the core desires that God builds into men to go accomplish. When we understand, using your language, the standard, then we can execute in a way that is more beneficial, more kingdom giving, kingdom building, rather than just self-building, or for many, it's self-destructive. I don't want to steal your thunder, because it feels like that's a great segue into what you wrote about. So your book, The Standard, Discovering Jesus as the Standard for Masculinity, you literally took his life as a blueprint, pulled from it certain standards, and then present them to the reader. So give us an overview of what that looks like.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about a good introduction to it already. So this book is written specifically for men. It doesn't matter if you're a Christian or not a Christian. If you're not a Christian, that's great. You'll get a new view of Jesus, and it will be something that will be useful for you and that I believe you can apply in your life. And you will get to know the real Jesus. If you know Jesus and you're already walking with him, it'll be something that will make him more accessible and give you some practical handles on what does this look like to follow Jesus in everyday life. I mean, the best review that I got from a couple close friends of mine that read the book was this statement: "This is the most non-religious book I read on Jesus." I'm like, that's awesome, because I wasn't trying to give you a religious Jesus. We really start with a couple things we've already hit on in this show so far. We lay the groundwork in the intro to just walk through what is the difference between the Son of God and the Son of Man. Why does Jesus call himself that? And what is this whole thing with him showing up as a human? Why did that have to happen? And we get into that a little bit. It doesn't get too theological, but we just lay some great, theology and some foundations from the Bible, that he emptied himself, that this was the plan of God for him. And as I was studying his life and reading the Gospels with this new lens and just seeing what the Lord was doing, I was watching what he was doing, why he was doing it, and I started seeing these themes were getting highlighted to me. So they were kind of like downloads from the Lord, where I just saw 6 dimensions in his life. There's many more. This is not exhaustive on the life of Jesus, right? We can go, he's the Christ of unsearchable riches. So we could talk about him forever. Not even all the books in the world can contain who he is or what he did, even while he was on earth. So with that as a background, there's 6 dimensions that I looked at specifically, which is self-mastery, the way he led himself. Because if you're a man and you're listening to this, we all aspire to leadership. You use a word that I love, taking dominion. We all want to take dominion. We want to build something. We want to leave that legacy. Well, the first thing we have to do, and what Jesus models for us, is that we have to learn how to lead ourselves first. Right? So that's that self-mastery component. After that, I look at the dimension of leadership in his life. Jesus was a phenomenal leader. He built teams. Like if you look at just from a business blueprint, for showing up on the scene and having no social media, no television, no media at all, taking 12 guys from the marketplace, where most people would say you're destined to fail with these guys, right? They're illiterate, they're fishermen, they come from all different walks of life. He totally transforms them through a 3-year mentorship. And then they turn the world upside down, right? So if you want to talk about leadership, let's look at what he does and how he leads. So that's the second dimension I look at. I'll just go quick through these, Mark, and then you can take me wherever you want to go, and we can dive into whatever level you want to. And then next, I look at his role in communication. And communication is the way he communicates. He did it through telling stories. We know he uses a lot of parables, and he uses terms, references that the people of that day would easily understand. And what I love about the way Jesus speaks and communicates, and by the way, he's still speaking today and he's still communicating this way. And it is this principle of inviting us into discovery. I said it earlier at the show, if you want to know the Lord, take a step towards him and he'll take a step towards you. And it's the same way with the principle behind the parables. He wraps these stories in riddles, where if you're a superficial listener, if you're just kind of listening from a distance and say, hey, I want to check it out, like, what's this about? You're not going to get it. It's for those who really dig in, for those who tune in. And this is why Jesus always says, listen up at the end, right? He's saying, if you have ears to hear this. And that's the modern equivalent of saying, listen up, listen to what I say, pay attention. That's what he's saying for those that want to hear it, so not everyone's listening. And then we talk about empathy. Right now you mentioned the boardroom. I also come from a corporate environment, and right now it's all the rage in any kind of corporate training and any kind of training with anything to do with people is this term EQ, demonstrating your emotional intelligence. And demonstrating empathy. And Jesus does this so tactfully and so masterfully. So we have a whole dimension on how he communicates, but specifically his emotional intelligence and the role of empathy. And then we talked about how Jesus is strong. We get into that as well, that he's a man of confrontation. And we look at that. Then we wrap up with his mission of love, which drove him to the cross. And we just have a few pages on that dimension of love in his life, which fueled his mission to come after us on this rescue mission and to restore us into right standing with the Father.
So here's what's coming up for me, which is, again, part of the reason why I wanted to have this conversation. And it's this: when we can grasp Jesus as approachable, accessible, like somebody that we can relate to, even though there's elements of his life that we can't, right? Perfection, not perfection. When we can grasp the accessibility, the humanness of him, then I think it allows us to then realize there's a significant part we play in becoming the men that we were created to be. Now, yes, there's the salvation chasm that we could never get across. But I've heard you say this, and I totally believe it. Much of the wisdom that we find in our world today can be found in the text that was written thousands of years ago. It wasn't called EQ at the time. It wasn't necessarily called self-mastery. Those are the words that we put to it. But the model was there and the blueprint was there. And so we see Jesus now as this human and a standard that he set that we can strive toward. And then you pull out things like, okay, what does it look like to lead myself well, to have that self-mastery so that I can go into the home or onto the little league field as a coach or into the boardroom or wherever I can go lead there as well. And then the emotional intelligence and the communication skills and all fueled by love. Suddenly it becomes like, oh, this is what I'm supposed to be about, cooperating with what Jesus and the Spirit and Father are able to do and about, and you put the package together, and you get toward what God has planned for us as men. I see you shaking your head, nodding along. Respond.
Yeah, I think you did a great job summarizing that. A couple of things I want to point out as we're talking about this, because we talked about earlier, you were talking about, I think you said something about practicing and just, like we want to be ready for game time. We want to be ready with what we do and what we take action on. And we were talking a little bit about self-mastery. So for every man, Jesus gives us a model for preparation. So there's something in his life where, if you think about it, we know he lived to around 33 and a half or so. The first 30 years of his life were spent in obscurity. We don't know a ton about that other than he was a blue collar guy, other than I'm sure he offered exceptional customer service, but he also was in the daily grind. So if that's where someone is right now and you're thinking like, how do I live my best life? Like, what am I supposed to do? How do I take dominion in life? How do I follow Jesus? Like, this is so unrelatable to me. Like, he suffered and he was tempted in every way that we're tempted, only he never failed. And he went through the mundane activities, so when you think of like, man, I got to get up and punch the clock today, or like, I want to hit snooze today. Like, Jesus had those feelings too. And then when he launches out into his ministry, when the Spirit comes upon him and he's baptized and there's some Old Testament prophecy being fulfilled there, the first thing he does is he goes into the wilderness. He doesn't step right onto the stage and like all these accolades are flying. He first goes to get tested, right? The practice. And there's huge things that we can get from that in preparing ourselves for our season. So Mark, I truly believe this. Every man has a season. Every man has a mountain. Every man listening to this, you have something the Lord prepared you to do. You may be doing it now, or you may be most likely you're in a preparation stage getting ready to do it. But we have Psalm 1 as a promise. And Psalm 1 says that we will in right time bear fruit in our season. So there's a season for every man that will bear fruit. There was a season in the life of Jesus. That season was 3 years, maybe 3.5 years. And there's preparation, there's testing, there's some suffering, there's some obedience, there's some things he has to do to get ready so he can go through and totally fulfill and bring forth, like we know in a harvest time, some 30, some 60, some 100-fold. Jesus brings in the harvest. He shows us and models what 100-fold looks like. So he's our model, he's our standard, but I want us to learn from what he does and how he prepares himself as well. So that's just something that I'm thinking about as you were reiterating, your recapitulation of some of the things we talked about.
I've been working my way through Samuel, First Samuel, Second Samuel recently, and I was struck the other day by David and his patience in the testing and in the preparation period to not jump the gun. There were numerous opportunities he had available to him to take the promise that was given. Like at this point, he'd already been anointed as the future king, and yet he didn't. He spared Saul's life, I don't know, at least twice that I can recall. Mm-hmm. And he was willing to submit to the timing in order to receive the promise that had already been given to him. And so as you were talking, I'm thinking about the preparation and the patience and the waiting, whether it's in the mundane, whether it's in the obscurity, whatever it is. We're all called to something different. We all have seasons, but part of following that model, we can also see thousands of years before, or at least hundreds of years before in David, which is just waiting for God's timing to accomplish what he wants to accomplish and what's been promised.
Yeah, so awesome. And Jesus did the same thing, like later in his ministry. He would be tempted, right? He would have opportunities to step out of his calling and do something the Father didn't want him to do. And he never takes the bait, right? He has haters that follow him. He's got the Pharisees around him. They're constantly trying to get him to do something or act out of his calling. And if it was you or me, Mark, we might have taken the bait. We might have said, you know what, I'm done with this, or I'm going to respond this way. But instead, he always models this way of servant leadership. He models this way that's contrary to the world's ways. So when we talk about setting the standard, it really is, he sets something for us that's contrary to everything within our human nature.
So I have so many more notes and so many more ideas and questions, places that we could go, but I will resist that urge. But I want to ask you just one final question. So I never know who these conversations are for, which man, which father, which fathers are listening. But I do believe that there's somebody out there that needs to hear this message. And so, what if you could make sure that person heard one thing, like just one thing from our conversation as a takeaway, what would that be?
That's a really powerful question, Mark. And for anyone who's listening to this, I believe you were meant to listen to it. So if you find yourself listening to this conversation, I believe it's because God drew you to Mark's podcast and he wants you to hear this message that Jesus sets the standard for us as men. And here's my one message that I want to get across is we're talking about lifting up a standard. We're talking about following a higher way. The key message here is that, guys, we don't do this in our own strength. We don't do this out of sheer willpower. Right now, there's a message in the world that says, grit, grind, and hustle. Hustle hard, rise and grind. Let's get after it. And we're programmed that way because that's the way we work. If you have work ethic, if you're pursuing your dream, if you have ambition, that's the way the world does it. That's the way we've been brought up to do it. But when it comes to living the Christian life, we don't live it out of our own strength. I mean, we gave that example earlier that Jesus took men of weakness and he made them strong. So in and of myself, I can't live this life. I have to live it by another life within me. And that's the offer that Jesus makes men. And he gives us his life. He'll tell Nicodemus, you must be born again to see the kingdom. And there's a lot of references to when we accept him, we get a new nature. We're partakers in the divine nature, and we're no longer living out of our human nature. We live out of a different identity. And so my one takeaway for anyone listening to this is you don't have to try harder. It's not about a behavior modification checklist. It's not about how many times did I fail or beating myself up. It's a free gift. We're saved by grace, and the Lord invites us into that. So no matter where you are today, no matter what condition, what kind of state of mind you're in as you're hearing this, the invitation of Jesus stands right now where he says, come to me, anyone who's got heavy burdens, stress, anxiety, you're overwhelmed in life, you're overburdened, you have so much stuff going on, no one gets it, no one understands it. That's who he's calling to. And he's saying, lay that stuff down, follow me. It's easy. It will be a hard road. It's not going to be an easy road in the sense of he makes every aspect of our life easier, but he takes the burden. And that's easy for us. And he leads the way. So we don't do this alone. We don't do it in our own strength, our own power. He does it through us, through his life.
So good, man. So good. So for the guy or guys that want to connect with you, remind us again, book and the best way for them to be able to get in contact and follow you.
Yeah, the best way. So my last name's Khachadourian. It's not the easiest to spell, Mark. So if you're going to Google it or try and find it on Amazon, sometimes it's a little bit harder. So the best thing to do is just go to my website, which is standard59.com, standard59, the numbers 59.com. And you'll find all my information there. You can follow me on social at Kingdom Athlete. I'm on Instagram and Facebook. And you can look up the Standard, Discovering Jesus as the Standard for Masculinity on Amazon. But if you're having trouble, just go to standard59.com. You'll get everything you need right there. And thank you so much, Mark. This was awesome. It was really an honor to have this discussion with you, to be on your show. I love your mission. I want to support it. And you're doing great work here.
Well, the pleasure's all mine. Thank you for engaging. I knew the topic would get you interested, and I appreciate your willingness to come on the show and to rumble with this topic, and also to rumble with the topic in your own life, to wrestle with it and work through it so that you can come back from that wrestling and rumbling experience and deliver a message, like I said at the top, that's timely. This is a message we need to hear. It's timeless for sure, but it's timely in where we are today. So, dude, thank you so much. I appreciate it. And I wish you all the best in your work in this space and wherever Father takes you.
Awesome, Mark. Thank you so much.
Guys, I hope you found something in here that you can take away with. You know the drill. Don't let this just be information. Let it be transformational. I don't know what that is for you. Maybe it's checking out the website. Maybe it's getting a copy of the book. Maybe it's just drawing into Jesus another step or two, whatever it is. May that be the action that you take as a result of this conversation. All right, that's it. We'll put a bow on it here. You guys know the drill. Same bat time, same bat channel next week. Until then, adios. To send us your comments or questions, you can email us at feedback@thenextmanup.com. The theme music is by Jacob Stanifer at Jacob Stanifer Music, and this show is part of the NRT Podcast Network.